Hi, everybody. Welcome back for your history class. I'm glad you were able to come to Nyack College for your one time for the semester. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that's called the greatest war, World War I. Now, I know in previous classes, we talked, especially in our art class, about how World War I influenced art after it was finished, and that people were very, very depressed and upset about how many people lost their lives during that time. So in World War I, it began on June 28, 1914. And the main cause, there were many causes, but the main cause for this war was the assassination, the killing of Austria's Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So this assassination took place after a number of things started building up in Europe. Number one, Austria had declared war on Serbia, so there were tensions there. Number two, militarism was beginning, and all the countries that are involved in World War I were beginning to build up their military. So we had Italy, and we had Austria-Hungary, and we had Germany, and then we had France, and we had England, and then we also had Russia. So militarism is starting to build. People are building up their armies, their navies, submarines are being built. So there's tensions there. Then we have imperialism. And that's when the Army and the Navy begin to get stronger and they start to attack areas and colonize, take those areas over for themselves. And the next cause that puts everything together in the Great War, World War I, is when nationalism takes a very strong hold. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is the belief in one's own country, the belief that their country, your country, is the strongest, the best, offers the very most. So we're talking about like 6 different countries here, and they're all building up their military, and they all have strong nationalist beliefs that they're the best, they offer most, they're the strongest. And they begin to build alliances. Alliances are like friendships, okay? It's a gathering together of people who have the same thoughts. So with nationalism, people believe that with this alliance, this friendship, they can grab as much land and as much power as they want. And they become very greedy, okay? So when we look at this, we see that there are a number of reasons why the war is starting to develop, okay? But sometimes with nationalism and the strength, the full strength that countries get through alliances and friendships, they begin to get a big picture of who they really are, how strong they really are, how much the people follow what they're thinking. So there's a lot of things that are going on, okay? So imperialism is when powerful nations rule and they exploit or they take over colonies and they use them for their own good. And this happened in Morocco when Kaiser, the ruler of Germany, was trying to build Germany up even stronger, to build a German empire. And he starts to move into Morocco. France wanted to take over Morocco at the same time. So they were battling for Morocco, and Morocco does get taken over by France. And the Kaiser, the ruler of Germany, becomes humiliated that he has lost this battle, this quest for Morocco, and to get more land for Germany. So he decides something. He decides that he wants revenge. He wants to get back at a country that's taking what he wanted to begin with. So the militarism, the military power is starting to get stronger in each of these areas. And Kaiser Wilhelm, the ruler of Germany, announces that he's going to build up his army stronger than ever, making it bigger than the British army. Now, Britain has an extremely strong army. It has a strong navy, but the Kaiser can't deal with that because in his mind, Germany is the strongest. He's using that idea of nationalism to make him think about all the things that Germany wants, should get, and has. So all these countries are building up their military at the same time, and France and Germany are building up their military, and they decide that it's time, these countries talk amongst themselves, and they decide to make alliances, as I said, friendships. And in 1914, the 6 most powerful countries in Europe divided into 2 opposing teams, opposing alliances. Alliances that believed in 2 different things. They were against each other. There was the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Okay, that's the Triple Alliance, those 3 countries. Austria-Hungary is considered one country. On the other end, another alliance forms, and that's the Axis, A-X-I-S powers. The Axis powers are Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, so they each have many reasons to distrust each other. Each side believes the other's trying to take what the other one has. They're both fearful because of the militaries are escalating, building up, getting stronger. So when there's the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, the war begins. So let's see if I can get you to see a little bit about this war. You're going to see an overview with it. Take some time to take in some information, and then we're going to talk about how the war was fought. We're going to talk about the conditions that the soldiers were in as they lived in trenches. We'll talk about how it goes on and all of the deaths that take place. In World War I, 9 million soldiers were dead and 21 million wounded. Okay, and at least 5 million civilians were wounded. So when we think back to when we talked about our art class and the dark and desperate and sad paintings we were seeing coming out after World War I, we know where this is coming from. It's coming from the extreme loss of life. And then we'll also go into what happens when the war ends and the Treaty of Versailles and why Germany signs it and how that's the impetus for our class for next week on why World War II starts and why Adolf Hitler is able to rise to power. But right now we're going to look at a video about World War I.
World War I, also known as the First World War, was a global war centered in Europe that began on 28th of July 1914 and lasted until the 11th of November 1918. The war lasted exactly 4 years, 3 months and 14 days. Before World War II began in 1939, World War I was called the Great War, the World War, or the War to End All Wars. 135 countries took part in World War I and more than 15 million people died. In this video, we're going to cover lots of facts and information about World War I. The conflict involved nearly all of the biggest powers in the world and was focused around two alliances, the Allies and the Central Powers. The countries of the Allies included Russia, France, the British Empire, Italy, United States, Japan, Romania, Serbia, Belgium, Greece, Portugal and Montenegro. The Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey and Bulgaria. Some of these World War I facts are incredible and very interesting when you consider that the events happened in very recent history. World War I began on June 28, 1914. It was triggered by the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his pregnant wife Sophie. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the throne of Austria and Hungary. The assassination was planned by a Serbian terrorist group called the Black Hand, and the man who shot Franz Ferdinand was a Bosnian revolutionary called Gavrilo Princip. One of the primary causes of World War I was a difference over foreign policy. Although the assassination of Franz Ferdinand triggered the war, that was only the immediate cause. Differences over foreign policy between the major world powers was the underlying cause of the war. And there were many other causes as well. A tangle of alliances that were made between countries to maintain a balance of power in Europe only served to escalate the scale of the conflict. The Bosnian crisis, where Austria-Hungary took over the former Turkish province of Bosnia in 1909, angered Serbia. Countries were building their military forces, their arms and their battleships, and it was only a matter of time before they wanted to use them. Countries that had lost territories wanted to regain them from previous conflicts and build their empires. The Moroccan crisis, where the Germans were protesting in 1911 against the French possession of Morocco, was also a factor. World War I was known by a number of different names. Other names for the war included the War to End All Wars, the War of the Nations, World War I, and the Great War. The Americans only actually joined World War I after 128 Americans were killed by a German submarine. In 1915, the British passenger ship Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine. In all, 1,195 passengers, including 128 Americans, lost their lives. Americans were outraged and put pressure on the US government to enter the war. President Woodrow Wilson wanted a peaceful end to the war, but in 1917, when the Germans announced that their submarines would sink any ship that approached Britain, Wilson declared that America would enter the war and restore peace to Europe. The United States entered World War I on April 6, 1917. Over 8 million soldiers died in World War I and 21 million were injured. 65 million troops in total were mobilised during the war. 58,000 British soldiers were lost on the very first day at the Battle of the Somme. World War I was also when chemical weapons were used for the first time. The chemical weapon of choice in World War I was mustard gas. The United States only spent 7.5 months in actual combat. During that time, 116,000 soldiers were killed and 204,000 were wounded. In the Battle of Verdun in 1916, there were over 1 million casualties in 10 months. By 1918, German citizens were striking and demonstrating against the war. The British Navy blocked German ports, which meant that thousands of Germans were starving and the economy was collapsing. Then the German Navy suffered a major mutiny. After German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9, 1918, the leaders of both sides met at Compiègne, France. The peace armistice was signed on November 11th, and by the end of the war, 4 empires, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had collapsed because of World War I. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles officially ended the World War. The treaty required that Germany accept full responsibility for causing the war and make reparations to some of the Allied countries. They also had to surrender some of their territory to surrounding countries, surrender its African colonies, and limit the size of its military. The treaty also established the League of Nations to prevent future wars. the League of Nations helped Europe to rebuild, and 53 nations had joined by 1923. But the US Senate refused to let the United States join the League of Nations, and as a result, President Wilson, who had established the League, suffered a nervous collapse and spent the rest of his term as an invalid. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926, but many Germans were very resentful of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1913, and then Italy withdrew 3 years later. The League of Nations was unable to stop the German, Italian and Japanese from expanding their power and taking over small countries. Many believe that World War I never really ended, and that World War II never would have happened if not for World War I. And now a few more really interesting and amazing facts about World War I. Did you know, for example, that an explosion on the battlefield in France was actually heard in England? Most of World War I was fought in mud and trenches, but a group of miners would also dig underground tunnels and detonate mines behind the enemy trenches. In Belgium, these miners detonated over 900,000 pounds of explosive at the same time, destroying the German front line. The explosion was so loud and powerful that it was heard by the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George 140 miles away in Downing Street, London. Many World War I journalists also risked their lives to report on the war. The government tried to control the flow of information from the front line during the war, and journalists were banned from reporting. The War Office considered reporting on the war as helping the enemy, and if journalists were caught, they faced the death penalty. A handful of journalists did risk their lives to report on the war and the harsh realities that the soldiers faced. Over 12 million letters were delivered to the front line every single week. Even during times of war, it only took 2 days for a letter to be delivered from Britain to France. A purpose-built mail sorting office was created in Regent's Park before the letters were sent to the trenches on the front line. By the time the war ended, over 2 billion letters and 114 million parcels had been delivered to the trenches. Another very interesting fact that you may not know, plastic surgery was invented because of World War I. One of the very earliest examples of plastic surgery came during World War I when a surgeon by the name of Harold Gillies helped shrapnel victims with terrible facial injuries. Shrapnel caused many facial injuries in World War I, and the twisted metal would inflict far worse injuries than the straight line wounds of a bullet. Dr. Gillies pioneered the early techniques for facial reconstruction. The youngest British soldier in World War I was just 12 years old. Over 250,000 underage soldiers were allowed to fight in World War I. The youngest was a boy named Sidney Lewis, who was just 12 years old, but he lied about his age to join. There were many thousands of underage boys who enlisted, and most of them lied about their age. Some joined for the love of their country, while others did it to escape from the lives and the poor conditions that they were living in. Another invention that came as a result of World War I are blood banks. It was during World War I that the routine use of blood transfusion was used to treat wounded soldiers. Blood was transferred directly from one person to another. In 1917, a US Army doctor by the name of Captain Oswald Johnson established the first blood bank on the Western Front. He used sodium citrate to prevent the blood from coagulating and becoming unusable. The blood was kept on ice for as long as 28 days and was transported when needed to casualty clearing stations for use in life-saving surgeries on soldiers who had lost a lot of blood. 9 out of 10 British soldiers actually survived the trenches. British soldiers actually were rarely in the firing line in World War I. They moved around the trench system constantly and were usually kept from the dangers of enemy fire. Most British soldiers' life in World War I would have been regular routine and boredom. It's also said that British Army generals had to be banned from going over the top. There's a common stereotype that ordinary soldiers were used by the higher-ups, lions led by donkeys, as the saying goes. The donkeys being the incompetent generals who didn't spend any time on the front line, while thousands of soldiers, the lions, were killed. Actually, so many British generals wanted to fight, they had to be banned from going over the top of the trenches because they were being killed, and the experience of a general was too important to lose. If you enjoyed these amazing facts about World War I, please do hit.
Now that was pretty neat, don't you think? So we looked at the reasonings about World War I, but it is a very bloody time. And from that, we see some developments in medicine that take place because of that. Number one, we see the idea of blood transfusions and blood banks starting. Now we have blood banks now, so that if we need to have surgery and we need to have some blood and a transfusion, they can use that. Well, they started doing it by laying one soldier next to the next soldier and transferring the blood from one to the other. However, later, Dr. Oswald was able to develop a way to keep the blood from clotting, coagulating, by adding some chemicals to it so that they could store the blood in packages on ice for almost 1 month and then transfer those packages of blood to areas of combat or hospitals that needed it. We also see that, of course, it's not plastic surgery as we think of it, but plastic surgery begins at this time because bits and fragments of bombs and debris are exploded and they fly into people's faces. And to take them out, it's a big procedure, and they need to make it as comfortable and look at least a little better than it did before. We did see something where soldiers are fighting in trenches. Trenches are made by digging up like a rectangle deep down into the soil. The Germans made superb trenches. They reinforced them with wood. They raised them in areas so that if it rained, their soldiers were above the water. But the British, when they're fighting, and the French, when they're fighting in quickly built trenches that are inside 2 walls of soil. And when it rains, the water collects into the trenches. Now, why do they build them? This is called trench, Trench, trench warfare, okay? They build it as a way to protect themselves. If they're standing upright and running in the fields and in the combat zones, they can be shot at. But if they're below ground and they're aiming their rifles out, they're protected by the ground. It also helps with some of the bombardment of what's being dropped by planes. So it's being sheltered from the Army's gun and their aim, and also from armament. Trench life was horrible, absolutely horrible. First of all, here are all these men. They're dug into a trench, so they're sort of trapped in where they are, and they're petrified of being killed. And they're waiting. They can hear fighting on, above the trenches. They can see planes flying over and bombing. They're petrified of dying. They're also very bored at times. Bored meaning sometimes there's no action at all, and all they're doing is sitting in the trench and waiting for something to happen. The poor living conditions and the boredom are starting to play on the minds of the soldiers, each of which then starts to sleep less. So sleep deprivation is leading to health issues, okay? And also to the stamina, the strength, the resilience, the will to fight. It's decreasing all of those things. So they're living in these trenches. The trenches are where they eat, sleep, and defecate, okay? It's filthy, it's smelly. So now rats are coming into the trenches. The trenches become overrun by rats. As you know, rats spread disease, and they were spreading disease. On the rats were lice. The lice, okay, were filling the trenches and biting the soldiers. And when it would rain, their feet would be constantly wet. and the bites from the lice would cause something called trench foot, where it was almost like when you get frostbite, parts of their toes and their feet were beginning to turn black and actually fall off or have to be amputated. So this was very, very terrible way of living. Not that it was perfect in the German trenches, but their trenches were built to be longer lasting. They realized that they'd be fighting for a while, so they built these stronger, more comfortable trenches, if it could be more comfortable. The British were digging these trenches quickly, hastily, not realizing what would happen if they don't do a good job. So I want you to take a look at this. This is really horrible, but one of the things that we talk about a lot when we talk about what soldiers went through during World War I.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
After saving with customized car insurance from Liberty Mutual,
So you saw how horrible that was and how mentally it played on the soldiers. They kept thinking that they would die in these trenches no matter what. And they were surrounded by the corpses of other men who were killed. Can you imagine what that would be like? You know about the fighting, you know how horrific it is, about all the people dying, about the shortage of food, the terrible health conditions, and you look out and maybe the edges of your trenches are dead bodies, or outside the trenches are more. Psychologically, this is very, very hard for the soldiers. The war goes on, and then it ends in the 11th month, on the 11th day of 1918. And Germany, without enough manpower and supplies, is going to be invaded, and they are going to surrender. Now, in the first video, we see that the people of Germany are getting angry. They're doing naval blockades where Germany and its people can't get supplies. People are hungry, they're starving. At one point, okay, at one point, the German Navy actually goes on strike. It stops fighting. Can you imagine? They're so fed up with the terrible conditions of what is happening that they refuse to go out on their ships. So Germany is forced to surrender, and they surrender to Britain, France, and to Russia. And they're beginning to feel very, very depressed, all right? So they're going to have to, and you heard about the Treaty of Versailles, but the leaders of Germany and the government tell the Kaiser, stop, surrender, and resign. And he does, he steps down. And then Germany and her allies are recognized as the enemy, and they are forced to sign a document which actually, and it was mentioned in this last video, the Treaty of Versailles, which angers the alliance and makes them feel very bitter. And they say that it seems like World War II never ended, because as we go over some of the facts about World War I, you will find that some of the things that are in the Treaty of Versailles are the things that anger the Germans later for World War II, and which brings strength to the German people to follow a leader like Adolf Hitler in World War II. So let's look a little bit at what goes on in the Treaty of Versailles. So the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and France meet together in Versailles and decide what should happen next. The war is done, they're going to hold Germany and the powers, the alliances that were with Germany, responsible for the war, for the damages of the war, okay? So Germany, Austria, Hungary, and were not invited to this meeting. They had no say in what was going to be put in the Treaty of Versailles. So these are disgraced countries. These are defeated generals, defeated leaders. They're feeling horribly. And now, even though everybody's been fighting in this war, but they feel even worse. They're disgraced. They had to accept the total blame of the war. Well, you know, maybe there was some fault on each side, right? But Austria, Hungary, and Germany had no say in what was written in this treaty. And they could not join this new League of Nations that was being formed, in which the United States, as you saw, was not allowed to join. The Congress did not want the US to join the League of Nations at that time. It was formed to stop any further world wars. And these countries were not happy. Some places that Germany had won, like Alsace-Lorraine in France, and we saw the part about Morocco, had to be given back to the countries that they were taken from. This too angered, Germany and Austria-Hungary. They were losing the lands that they really so wanted. Remember, they built up their military and they were following their nationalism because they felt that their way was the best way and they deserved the most land and the most colonies. And now they're forced to give that back as well. Keeping in mind as well that on both sides, huge numbers of men are dead who've been fighting, and also their casualties that are civilians. And also, the thing that really just makes them so angry is that they could not have an army of more than 100,000 men, and they could not build submarines. Now, you saw that the United States enters into World War I when a German submarine sinks the Lusitania, which is a passenger ship, and there are Americans on it. There has always been discussion that it was a passenger ship, but it was also bringing munitions and military supplies on it. That's what Germany says. We don't really know for sure, but that's what brought the United States into the war. So they wanted to prevent these countries from building submarines so they wouldn't be able to do the same thing. So everybody's really mad. Germany has to pay 130 million gold marks. That's the currency of Germany at the time before it went to the euro. And because of this, it made Germany very poor. Now, so we're looking at this whole picture. World War I started with a lot of countries vying to be the strongest, building up their armies, building up their military, causing fear on each side because, well, why are you building up your military? You're building up your military, maybe you're going to try to take stuff that we have away. Following in nationalism, which we're going to see a lot of in World War II, that their countries were the best and they needed to defend them. So, and then, there's this terrible loss of life on both sides. And then the Kaiser's asked to step down. And then they've lost, that section has lost the war. And then they suffer, the Triple Alliance countries suffer this other blow where they can't even come to the meeting for the Treaty of Versailles. It's decided with any input on them, and everything in it is against the Triple Alliance, and everything in it is forced to make the Triple Alliance admit that they were wrong, pay restitution for the damage that was done, making Germany very poor, and also making their protection, their military very low so that they can't strike out again. Now, we're going to talk next week about the start of World War II. But I did come across something that I thought was very interesting, and I wanted to start it this week since we're talking about the causes of World War I, or the fact that people believe that really World War I didn't really end because one side was so demoralized, okay? So I want to show you something about a conscientious objector to World War II. And it's called the medic who fought without a weapon, medic meaning a doctor. And I thought it was very interesting to see how in a war people are affected in so many different ways. So I'm going to let this lead into what's going to be next week's discussion, which will be the causes of World War II, the fighting of World War II, the conclusion, and then moving into the Cold War into the present day. So next week will be my last full lecture with you. And then the following week will be a review week for your final exam. So we're almost complete on this. But let's see what you think about this. I thought this was really very interesting.
Students with ADHD save 10 hours studying with this Chrome extension.
But no, by all means.
This video has been made possible by Conqueror's Blade. Conqueror's Blade is seeking to redefine what it means to be a free-to-play massive multiplayer online war game through strategic decision-making and historical feudal-era tactical combat, allowing you to bring the world under your house's banner. New Conqueror's Blade Season 10 will bring you fantastic experiences inspired by the rich history and ancient beauty of Scottish fields. Explore new units, maps, and facial tattoos of Scottish clans. Become a warlord and rush to conquer cities and mighty fortresses. Unlock new claymore-wielding warriors, archers, and their dear... The incredibly stupid one.
Hold on, let me see if I